The words echoed like a thunderclap across Buckingham Palace walls, though they were spoken in private. King Charles, a man who for decades had carried the weight of duty on his shoulders, reportedly told his youngest son Prince Harry that he would never forgive him. It wasn't the words alone that shook those close to the family, but the deep sorrow and finality in his voice, as though he had finally drawn a line that could never be crossed back over. To understand the magnitude of this moment, one must first go back to the roots of the father-son relationship that has been tested, battered, and stretched beyond breaking point. The story is not just about one disagreement or one fight. It is about years of mounting tension, public betrayals, and the unraveling of what should have been an unshakable bond between a father and his son. It is about the clash between personal loyalty and the centuries-old demands of monarchy. When Harry was born in September 1984, Charles looked upon his second son with a sense of relief and pride. The heir and the spare were now secured, and in the eyes of the world, Charles had fulfilled one of his most important royal duties. But Harry was more than just a royal insurance policy. To Charles, he was a spirited, mischievous boy who seemed to inherit Diana's charm and sparkle. Charles would often remark to those around him that Harry had a special way of making people laugh, a warmth that cut through even the frostiest of engagements. Yet behind palace walls, Charles's role as father was complicated by his role as future king. Duty often meant distance, and distance often bred misunderstandings. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The death of Princess Diana in 1997 shattered both William and Harry's world. For Harry, just 12 at the time, the pain of losing his mother was overwhelming. He walked behind her coffin in front of millions, holding in emotions that no child should ever be forced to hide. Charles, consumed by his own grief and the intense scrutiny of the press, struggled to provide the emotional sanctuary Harry craved. He was protective in his own way, making sure Harry and William were shielded as much as possible from media intrusion. But Charles was never one for open displays of affection. The stiff upper-lip royal approach left Harry feeling misunderstood, even abandoned. Seeds of resentment began to form. Over the years, as Harry grew older, those seeds took root. He joined the military, served with distinction, and seemed to find purpose in belonging away from the palace. For a time, his relationship with Charles appeared to stabilize, though never deeply intimate. Charles admired his son's bravery, his willingness to serve in combat zones, and his connection with ordinary soldiers. But the royal world Harry was born into never stopped suffocating him. His every misstep was tabloid fodder, every scandal blown out of proportion. Charles, often under attack by the press himself, would counsel patience, advising Harry to let time pass and controversies fade. But Harry was not like his father. He wasn't willing to stay silent when he felt wronged. Then came Meghan Markle. Harry's relationship with the American actress was a whirlwind, one that initially brought him hope, love, and a renewed sense of purpose. Charles welcomed Meghan into the family with civility, even walking her down the aisle when her own father was absent. Yet behind palace walls, concerns brewed. Meghan was outspoken, unwilling to play by royal rules, and unafraid to confront the institution's rigid traditions. Charles, who had spent decades learning to bend under the monarchy's weight, saw in Meghan a disruptor who might intensify Harry's rebellious streak. And he was right. The couple's departure from royal life, later dubbed Megxit, was the spark that ignited a firestorm. Charles, blindsided by the announcement, felt humiliated and betrayed. Harry and Meghan's sit-down with Oprah Winfrey poured salt on the wound. They spoke of racism, neglect, and cruelty within the royal family. Harry described his father as cold, unresponsive, and even financially cutting him off. Charles, who believed he had done more than any royal father before him to support and protect his children, was devastated. To be painted publicly as unloving was, in his eyes, not only untrue but deeply unfair. The release of Harry's memoir, Spare, was perhaps the most cutting blow of all. Within its pages, Charles was portrayed as a man distant and preoccupied, a father who didn't know how to comfort his sons in their darkest hour. The book dredged up private moments and reframed them as evidence of emotional neglect. To Charles, it was more than a criticism. It was an assault on his character at the most personal level. For decades, he had lived with the world seeing him as the cold husband to Diana. Now, his own son seemed determined to immortalize him as the cold father to Harry. Imagine being a man who has waited 70 years to ascend to the throne, who has endured scandal after scandal, ridicule, and heartbreak, only to finally be crowned king. And in the very moment of triumph, your own son releases stories to the world that diminish you not just as a monarch, but as a human being. For Charles, the humiliation was unbearable. It wasn't just about himself. It was about the monarchy, about Camilla, about William, and about the legacy he had worked so hard to preserve. Every attack Harry launched, whether in interviews, documentaries, or books, felt like another dagger to the monarchy's heart. But more than the monarchy, it was the personal betrayal that haunted him. This wasn't the media inventing stories. This wasn't political opponents stirring trouble. This was his son, his own blood, the boy he had once held in his arms, the young man he had tried to protect in his own restrained way, now turning his pain into a weapon aimed directly at him. Those closest to Charles have described how he would sit quietly, reading through excerpts of Harry's interviews, shaking his head, and whispering, "Why would he do this?" There were moments when he even questioned whether reconciliation was possible. The breaking point came when Charles reportedly confided in his inner circle that forgiveness was no longer on the table. "I will never forgive him," he said, words heavy with finality. It wasn't said in anger but in sorrow, as if resignation had replaced hope. Charles, known for his patience, for his lifelong attempts to bridge gaps within his family, had finally decided that Harry's attacks had crossed a line beyond repair. The father-son relationship was no longer just strained, it was broken. This story is not simply about Charles and Harry. It is about the clash between personal truth and collective duty. It is about a son's need to speak his truth, regardless of the consequences, and a father's need to protect not only his family, but an institution that has stood for over 1,000 years. It is about generational differences, the scars of Diana's death, the pressures of monarchy, and the ways in which love can be twisted by duty and resentment. As we journey through this story, we will explore how things reached this devastating point. What drove Harry to repeatedly speak against his family in public? Why did Charles, a man who has long sought harmony, decide that forgiveness was impossible? And what does this mean for the future of the monarchy, the family, and the legacy they are all so desperately trying to shape? What follows is not just a tale of royal drama, but a deeply human story of love, betrayal, pride, and pain. It is a story that forces us to ask, how much truth is too much when the price is the destruction of family? And in the end, is forgiveness truly impossible, or is it simply hidden, waiting for time to reveal whether wounds this deep can ever heal? This is where the story begins. In the beginning, long before the fractures and betrayals, there was a story of a father and a son who shared moments of joy, pride, and a fragile kind of affection that the world rarely saw. Prince Harry, born Henry Charles Albert David on September 15, 1984, was not just the second son of the then Prince of Wales. He was a boy who would embody both the light-hearted mischief of his mother, Diana, and the sense of duty and reserve of his father, Charles. For a time, the connection between the two was marked by warmth that history now tends to overlook. To understand why Charles's eventual words, his vow never to forgive, landed with such heaviness, one has to travel back to those early days when Harry's very existence brought a sense of completion to the royal family. When Harry was born, Charles was overjoyed in his own reserved way. The world remembers the photographs, Diana glowing with pride, Charles dutifully smiling as he stood beside her. With Harry's arrival, the monarchy had what it traditionally needed, an heir and a spare. But in Charles's mind, Harry was more than just a safeguard for succession. He was the spirited child who carried with him the warmth and cheekiness that reminded many of Diana. Harry had a way of breaking tension even as a baby, his infectious giggles softening moments that would otherwise feel heavy with the weight of royal expectation. The relationship between Charles and Harry in those early years was far from perfect, but it was not absent of tenderness. There were family holidays where Charles would insist on spending time outdoors with his sons, teaching them about nature, architecture, and history. He was a man who found solace in gardens and landscapes, and he tried to pass some of that passion on to William and Harry. Harry, unlike William, was less inclined to formality and more drawn to adventure. He thrived in the countryside, racing about with boundless energy, often leaving Charles both amused and exasperated. In those early days, Charles also saw in Harry a chance to express his softer side, something the public rarely glimpsed. When Diana's natural ease with the boys was evident, Charles sometimes struggled to match it, but with Harry, there were moments where he tried. Harry's cheeky smiles and disarming honesty softened the prince who was so often criticized for being distant. Yet, at the same time, Charles's commitment to duty, public appearances, and the pressures of royal life meant that time together was often limited. Those who worked in the palace during the 1980s remember how Diana would often take the lead in parenting, while Charles retreated into engagements, speeches, and the demands of his position as heir to the throne. Still, there was no doubt that Charles loved his younger son. His pride in Harry's mischievous yet kind-hearted nature was clear whenever he spoke of him. Royal biographers recount moments where Charles described Harry as someone who could make anyone laugh, no matter their mood, a rare quality in the often stiff corridors of the monarchy. This warmth, however, would come under strain as the complexities of family life, media intrusion, and personal tragedy began to weigh down on the bond. The death of Princess Diana in 1997 marked a devastating turning point. At just 12 years old, Harry was thrust into a world of grief played out under the scrutiny of millions. The image of him walking behind his mother's coffin alongside Charles, William, and others remains etched in history. For the young boy, the experience was traumatizing. For Charles, the challenge was immense. He had to balance the demands of a grieving father with the expectations of a nation looking to him for stability. Charles did what he thought best in the wake of Diana's death. He tried to shield his sons. He took them to Balmoral, away from the intrusive cameras, giving them time in the Scottish countryside to process their grief. But his way of handling sorrow was rooted in restraint, in carrying pain silently. For Harry, who needed open comfort and reassurance, this approach felt like emotional distance. The cultural expectation of royals to maintain composure became, in Harry's eyes, yet another barrier to the raw expression of love and grief that he desperately craved. Over the years, this difference in emotional expression created small fissures in their relationship. Where William seemed to adapt more naturally to Charles's reserved parenting style, Harry longed for something more. He wanted empathy in words, affection in actions, and a sense of emotional security that the royal family's traditions rarely provided. Charles was not intentionally withholding. He simply struggled to offer what he himself had never received from his own parents. The Queen and Prince Philip had raised Charles with duty as the highest priority, and he, in turn, replicated that model, albeit with slightly more warmth. But for Harry, who carried the wounds of losing his mother so young, it was never enough. Despite this, the early 2000s showed glimmers of closeness. Harry's teenage years were turbulent, marked by rebellion, scandals, and missteps that embarrassed the monarchy. Charles, though frustrated, often intervened quietly to manage the fallout. He pushed for Harry to enter military service, believing it would instill discipline and give him purpose. In this, Charles's guidance proved invaluable. Harry thrived in the military, finding camaraderie and identity away from the constraints of royalty. Charles expressed pride in his son's service, especially when Harry insisted on being deployed to active war zones, showing bravery that won admiration from the public. Yet even in those moments of pride, distance remained. Charles was proud, yes, but rarely expressive in ways that Harry understood as love. Harry's view of his father became a complicated one, respect for the man's sacrifices, mixed with resentment for his lack of warmth. For Harry, it always seemed as though his father's duty came first, while his role as a parent came second. One cannot ignore Diana's influence in this dynamic. Harry, often compared to his mother, carried her spirit of empathy and rebellion. Charles, often cast as Diana's opposite, became in Harry's eyes the figure against whom he measured affection and loyalty. Where Diana had been openly affectionate, Charles was cautious. Where Diana had been emotionally present, Charles seemed distant. This contrast made Harry's longing for connection with his father all the more painful, because he knew what it felt like to be loved so openly, and to have lost it so tragically. As the years passed, the public perception of Charles as a distant father only deepened, particularly as Harry's struggles became more visible. Every scandal, every headline, every personal revelation added weight to the narrative that Charles had not done enough. While William stood as the dutiful son and heir, embodying loyalty to the crown, Harry increasingly embodied the restless spirit unwilling to conform. Charles found himself caught between pride and despair, between admiration for Harry's individuality and sorrow for his rebellion. And yet, beneath it all, there were moments, private and unspoken, when Charles longed to bridge the gap. He admired Harry's ability to connect with people, to touch lives with authenticity, something Charles himself had always aspired to but struggled to achieve. In Harry, he saw both the best of Diana and the potential of a royal who could modernize the family's image. That is why, in those earlier years, he kept trying. He supported Harry financially, provided him with opportunities, and defended him when others were quick to criticize. But with each effort came setbacks, and with each setback came another layer of misunderstanding. This chapter of their story is essential because it shows that the bond was never completely absent. It was fragile, imperfect, and often overshadowed by royal duty, but it was real. The memory of those early days, the mischievous boy and the proud father, makes the eventual breakdown all the more tragic. To grasp the depth of Charles's later declaration, one must remember that it came after years of effort, years of love shown in ways that were often misunderstood, and years of a bond that, though strained, was not beyond repair, at least, not yet. The foundation of their relationship, built in childhood and fractured in grief, sets the stage for everything that follows. Before the world saw a king declaring that he could never forgive, there was once a father who quietly, imperfectly, tried to love his son. But love, without understanding, can often be mistaken for neglect. And misunderstanding, left unresolved, becomes the beginning of a fracture that can grow into an unbridgeable chasm. The story of Prince Harry and his father could have perhaps remained one of strained affection and intermittent closeness had it not been for the dramatic entrance of Meghan Markle into the royal picture. Meghan was not just another romantic partner. She represented a shift, a new chapter in Harry's life that promised love and companionship, but also brought with it turbulence that would forever change the royal family. For King Charles, Meghan's arrival marked the beginning of a deeper rupture, not simply because of who she was, but because of what she symbolized: independence, resistance to tradition, and a refusal to bow to the rigid codes of the monarchy. When Harry introduced Meghan to his family, Charles reportedly made every effort to be welcoming. In those early encounters, he treated her with courtesy and civility, even warmth. Observers noted that Charles seemed to recognize Meghan's modern charisma, her confidence, and her ability to connect with people. For a man who had long been misunderstood himself, Charles could have admired her outspokenness. He even offered symbolic gestures of support that seemed to acknowledge her importance to Harry, most memorably when he walked Meghan down the aisle on her wedding day after her father's absence created a void. To the public, that gesture seemed magnanimous and compassionate, proof that Charles was willing to embrace his son's new life with open arms. Yet beneath the surface, the undercurrents of tension were already flowing. Meghan was not like the women Charles had been surrounded by in royal circles. She was American, biracial, divorced, outspoken, and ambitious. To the monarchy, which thrives on tradition and predictability, she was an unpredictable variable. Harry, deeply in love, was blinded to the brewing concerns, but Charles, shaped by decades of palace life, could sense the storm on the horizon. His instincts told him that Meghan would challenge not just Harry's relationship with the family, but also the very structure of the institution itself. From the beginning, Meghan's relationship with the press was turbulent. Tabloids devoured her past, her family drama, and her every move, creating headlines that quickly turned toxic. Harry, protective and wounded by memories of his mother's torment at the hands of the media, grew defensive. He saw in Meghan's struggles a haunting echo of Diana's pain. Charles, however, viewed the situation differently. He had spent decades surviving under the scrutiny of the press, enduring relentless criticism, and slowly learning the art of resilience. To him, it was part of royal life, a burden that could be managed with patience. But to Harry, who could not bear to see history repeat itself, it was intolerable. Here lay one of the first deep rifts in their perspectives. Charles saw endurance, Harry saw injustice. The palace culture also played a role. Meghan entered a world governed by unspoken rules and centuries-old customs. What to wear, how to speak, when to smile. Every detail mattered in the royal performance. Meghan, unaccustomed to such rigid formality, struggled to conform. She voiced her frustrations, and Harry, eager to defend her, often clashed with those within the palace who insisted on protocol. Charles, who had himself once struggled under the monarchy's weight, might have sympathized, but he also knew the dangers of defiance. For him, survival within the institution required compromise. Watching Harry and Meghan openly resist this system felt like watching them ignite a fire he knew could not be easily controlled. What made the situation even more complex was the way Harry's love for Meghan seemed to redefine his entire outlook on family loyalty. Before Meghan, Harry had expressed his frustrations with the press and the institution, but rarely with such intensity toward his family itself. After Meghan, those frustrations crystallized into accusations. He began to see his father and brother not merely as family members struggling under the same pressures, but as complicit actors in a system that was suffocating him and his wife. For Charles, this shift was devastating. What had once been occasional disagreements now became pointed criticisms aimed at the family and, at times, directly at him. Still, Charles continued to extend gestures of support. He provided the couple with a residence, offered financial backing for a time, and tried to mediate growing tensions with other family members. But these efforts were overshadowed by the growing chasm between Harry's emotional perspective and Charles's practical one. Harry believed the family had failed to defend Meghan from racist and cruel tabloid attacks. Charles, while sympathetic, prioritized the long-term stability of the monarchy over public confrontations with the press. To Harry, this looked like indifference. To Charles, it was the only sustainable path forward. The wedding itself was a turning point. On the surface, it was a celebration, a moment of unity. The images of Charles escorting Meghan down the aisle were splashed across the world as symbols of acceptance. But behind the scenes, tensions were mounting. Reports of disagreements between Meghan and members of the family, whispers of cultural clashes, and hints of strained relationships with palace staff were already swirling. Charles, caught in the middle, was forced to navigate an increasingly delicate balance, supporting his son while safeguarding the monarchy's dignity. As time went on, Meghan and Harry's frustrations with royal life grew. The limitations felt suffocating, the lack of vocal support from the institution unbearable. They wanted independence, freedom, and the ability to control their own narrative. Charles, however, knew the dangers of stepping outside the monarchy's protective framework. He had seen firsthand how quickly public opinion could turn savage, how fragile the royal image was when stripped of its traditions. For him, Harry and Meghan's determination to chart their own path seemed reckless, even self-destructive. But for Harry, it was the only way to protect his wife and create the life they both wanted. This divergence in perspective was the beginning of an irreparable turning point. What Charles saw as compromise and patience, Harry saw as betrayal and cowardice. What Charles believed was resilience, Harry interpreted as neglect. Meghan's entrance into the family didn't just bring love to Harry's life. It magnified every difference between father and son. She became the catalyst for Harry to confront what he had long felt, that his family valued the crown more than they valued him. It is important to understand that Charles did not despise Meghan personally. His actions, walking her down the aisle, defending her presence, showed an effort to welcome her. But Meghan represented change, and change in the monarchy has always come at a cost. For Charles, the cost was trust. For Harry, the cost was loyalty. The father-son bond, already delicate, began to crack under the weight of these competing truths. In hindsight, Meghan's entrance was not the cause of the fracture but the magnifying glass that exposed it. She revealed the fault lines in Harry's relationship with his father, fault lines that had been forming since Diana's death. By standing beside Meghan, Harry chose a path that inevitably placed him at odds with Charles. For Charles, the realization was painful. His son was not just seeking independence, he was rejecting the very institution that defined their family. And in that rejection lay the seeds of future betrayal, words spoken in interviews and written in books that Charles would one day declare he could never forgive. The arrival of Meghan Markle marked the moment when father and son began to walk two different roads, one bound by the crown, the other guided by love and defiance. And once those paths diverged, reconciliation became not just difficult, but almost impossible. The world had watched royal tensions before, but nothing quite like this. When Harry and Meghan announced their decision to step back from their roles as senior royals in January 2020, the monarchy was jolted in a way that shook not just Buckingham Palace, but the entire world. It wasn't simply a resignation. It was a rupture, a declaration of independence from an institution that prided itself on duty, tradition, and continuity. For Charles, the moment was devastating not only as king-in-waiting, but as a father. It was not just that his son was leaving, but that his departure was carried out in a manner that left him blindsided, humiliated, and deeply wounded. This moment, coined by the media as Megxit, was the explosion that turned private tensions into a global spectacle. The official statement was released on the Sussex's website. Harry and Meghan announced they would be stepping back as senior members of the royal family, intending to split their time between North America and the United Kingdom while pursuing financial independence. To the public, it seemed shocking but carefully crafted. To the royal household, however, it was a bombshell that landed without warning. Charles, who had endured decades of planning for the monarchy's future, was caught off guard. The palace machine, with its meticulous choreography, was not prepared. Behind closed doors, Charles's reaction was one of disbelief and sorrow. He had been aware of the couple's growing frustrations, of course. Meghan and Harry had spoken about their struggles with media scrutiny and the burdens of royal protocol. But Charles had not anticipated such a drastic and unilateral announcement. What pained him most was that his son hadn't come directly to him before making the decision public. In Charles's eyes, Harry had chosen to inform the world before confiding in his father. For a man who valued discretion and hierarchy, this was not just betrayal, it was humiliation. The aftermath unfolded like a political crisis. Meetings were hastily convened at Sandringham between the Queen, Charles, William, and Harry to discuss the path forward. Dubbed the Sandringham Summit, it was a gathering that would determine the terms of Harry and Meghan's new life. Reports from insiders suggested that Charles went into the meeting torn between two roles, as a father desperate not to lose his son, and as the future king responsible for preserving the monarchy's stability. Those who were present described him as weary, even broken, watching his youngest son insist on walking away from the very life he had been born into. The negotiations were tense. Harry reportedly pushed for a half-in, half-out model, one where he and Meghan could continue to represent the crown on their own terms while also pursuing private commercial ventures. To Harry, this seemed like the best compromise. To Charles, and indeed to the institution as a whole, it was impossible. The monarchy's power lies in its impartiality, its separation from personal financial interest. Allowing Harry and Meghan to straddle both worlds risked tainting the crown with conflict of interest. For Charles, the decision was clear. They could either be in or out, but not both. The rigidity of this stance reflected not only institutional necessity, but also Charles's own fear that compromise would unravel the monarchy's fragile balance. In the end, Harry and Meghan chose out. They surrendered their HRH titles and royal patronages, though they retained their Duke and Duchess titles. For Charles, it was a bittersweet resolution. On one hand, the monarchy had drawn its line and preserved its boundaries. On the other, he had lost his son to a life of independence thousands of miles away. The public fallout was immediate and fierce. Media outlets across the world dissected every angle, from Meghan's alleged unhappiness to Harry's defiance. Some accused Meghan of manipulating Harry, while others painted the monarchy as an outdated institution unwilling to adapt. Through it all, Charles remained largely silent, as he so often had in moments of crisis. But behind the silence, he was deeply wounded. Those close to him revealed that he felt both betrayed and abandoned, especially by the way Harry had allowed the announcement to unfold without proper consultation. For Harry, the decision was born of love and survival. He had seen how the press had hounded his mother, and he refused to let history repeat itself with his wife and future children. He saw the institution's inability to protect Meghan as a reflection of its unwillingness to protect Diana. He believed leaving was the only way to safeguard his family's well-being. For Charles, however, the exit was proof that Harry had chosen his wife over his family, love over duty, and freedom over loyalty. The symbolism of Megxit was not lost on anyone. It marked the first time in modern history that a senior royal voluntarily stepped away so publicly and defiantly. To the monarchy, it was a crack in the facade of unity that had long been its greatest weapon. To Charles, it was personal. It was the loss of a son to a world that he could neither control nor understand. The consequences of this decision would reverberate for years to come. The Sussexes relocated to California, where they began to build a new life. They signed lucrative deals with streaming platforms, launched a foundation, and began speaking openly about their grievances with the royal family. Each move was another reminder to Charles that his son had not only left, but had chosen a path that put him in direct opposition to the institution he had dedicated his entire life to preserving. Megxit was more than an exit. It was the tearing open of wounds that had been festering for decades. It exposed the fragility of the father-son bond and magnified every misunderstanding and resentment. For Charles, it was a moment he would never forget, the day his son chose independence over family, love over crown, and freedom over forgiveness. This chapter was the explosion that set the stage for all that followed. The interviews, the memoir, the ongoing accusations, none of it would have been possible without the decisive break of Megxit. It was the beginning of the end, the moment where Charles stopped believing that reconciliation might be simple and began to feel the weight of betrayal more heavily than ever before. If Megxit was the act that ruptured the bond between Harry and his father, the Oprah Winfrey interview was the moment it shattered into pieces before the eyes of the world. On March 7, 2021, Harry and Meghan sat down with Oprah in a 2-hour primetime television special that would send shockwaves through the monarchy and leave King Charles reeling. The interview was not just a conversation. It was an airing of grievances, a public indictment of the institution, and by extension, of Charles himself. For the father who had long endured criticism from the media and public, to now face accusations from his own son on an international stage was perhaps the most humiliating blow yet. The build-up to the interview already carried the weight of anticipation. The couple, having settled in California, had largely kept silent since leaving royal duties. But their silence had been punctured by speculation, criticism, and relentless coverage in the British press. When the news broke that they would sit down with Oprah, the palace braced itself. Charles, ever cautious, hoped it would be measured, a chance for Harry to explain his position without attacking his family. What unfolded instead was more damaging than he could have imagined. During the interview, Meghan revealed that during her pregnancy with Archie, there had been conversations within the family about how dark her baby's skin might be. The revelation was explosive, painting the monarchy as not just outdated but racially insensitive. For Charles, who had spent years trying to modernize the image of the crown, this accusation was deeply wounding. Though the couple did not name him directly, speculation quickly swirled, and Charles found himself under the cloud of suspicion. To be accused of such a thing, even indirectly, was devastating both personally and as the heir to the throne. Harry, for his part, spoke about feeling trapped within the system, about being cut off financially by his family, and about his father's failure to answer his calls at one point during the fallout. These words struck like daggers. For decades, Charles had been criticized by the press as distant and cold, and now his son was reinforcing that narrative on the world stage. For Charles, who believed he had done more for his children than his own parents had ever done for him, it was a betrayal that hurt in ways few could comprehend. It wasn't just the accusations themselves, but the way they were delivered. The world was watching as Harry laid bare private conversations, painting a portrait of a family unwilling to support him. Charles, who had walked Meghan down the aisle in a gesture meant to symbolize welcome, was now being portrayed as unresponsive and indifferent. For a man who had spent years building a reputation for compassion through his charitable work, the contrast was crushing. Behind palace walls, the response was carefully calculated. The Queen issued a statement that delicately addressed the claims, saying that recollections may vary, while expressing concern about the issues raised. But Charles was less diplomatic in private. Insiders reported that he was heartbroken and furious, not just at the accusations but at the public nature of them. For Charles, family disputes were to be handled quietly, behind closed doors. To see them broadcast to millions was, in his eyes, unforgivable. The interview also reinforced Harry's view that his father had not protected him or Meghan from the media storm. Harry said he felt let down, that Charles had lived through something similar with Diana, but still failed to shield them. For Charles, this was a twisting of the truth. He believed he had supported them financially and emotionally as much as possible, even when the institution limited his ability to intervene publicly. To hear his efforts dismissed so casually was both infuriating and heartbreaking. The fallout from the Oprah interview was immediate and severe. Headlines around the world condemned the monarchy, with some calling it archaic and racist. Public trust in the institution wavered, particularly among younger generations. For Charles, the damage was not just to his personal reputation, but to the crown itself. As the future king, he would have to carry the weight of these accusations, even if they were never proven or directly attributed to him. What made the moment so poignant was the silence that followed. Charles did not defend himself publicly. He did not give interviews or issue personal statements. He carried the burden in silence, as royals are trained to do. But behind the walls of Clarence House, those close to him described a man who felt both betrayed and cornered. He had lost control of the narrative, and worse, it was his own son who had taken it from him. The Oprah interview marked a point of no return. Up until then, there had been hope that time and distance might heal the wounds of Megxit. After the interview, reconciliation seemed impossible. The accusations were too severe, the humiliation too public, the pain too deep. Charles's silence was not indifference but resignation, a recognition that his son had chosen to fight him not privately, but before the court of global opinion. The interview did more than damage reputations. It redefined the relationship between Charles and Harry. It turned private grievances into public wars, ensuring that every future encounter would be overshadowed by what had been said. For Charles, it was not just the betrayal of a father by a son, but the betrayal of trust that could never be restored. And yet, for Harry, it was not betrayal at all. It was liberation. He believed he was telling his truth, protecting his wife, and breaking free from the silence that had cost his mother her peace. In that belief, he saw his actions as justified. But for Charles, watching from across the ocean, it was the most public confirmation yet that his son had chosen a path that left no room for forgiveness. The Oprah interview was not the final blow, but it was one of the deepest. It cemented the divide between father and son, turning their private pain into a global drama. From that night on, Charles's quiet anguish hardened into something more resolute. The words he would later utter, "I will never forgive him," were born in large part from this very moment, when his son chose to lay bare the family's wounds before the world. If the Oprah interview had left cracks in the walls of Buckingham Palace, Harry's memoir Spare was the wrecking ball that turned those cracks into gaping holes. Released in January 2023, the book became one of the fastest-selling nonfiction works in modern history, but it was more than just a bestseller. It was a declaration of war on the royal family. For Charles, who had endured decades of scrutiny from the press, the memoir was not just another wave of criticism. It was deeply personal. This time, it was his own son, his own blood, who had written a narrative that painted him in cold, unforgiving light. The very title of the book set the tone. Spare. It was a word that had haunted Harry since childhood, a reminder of his position as second best, the backup to his brother William. By naming his memoir after that painful moniker, Harry signaled that this was not a story of reconciliation but of resentment. From the opening pages, the reader was plunged into Harry's world of loss, grief, and anger, emotions that often pointed squarely at Charles. For Charles, reading those words, whether directly or through reports, was like reliving every failure as a father magnified and immortalized on the page. Harry wrote about moments that seemed to confirm what many had long speculated, that Charles was emotionally distant, preoccupied with duty, and ill-equipped to provide the warmth his son craved. He recalled how, after Diana's death, Charles had placed a hand on his shoulder but offered no words of comfort. He described his father as a man who struggled with affection, who preferred schedules and official engagements over time spent as a nurturing parent. For Charles, these depictions cut deep. They weren't fabrications. He knew he was not demonstrative in the way Diana had been, but they were partial truths, painted without the balance of context. He had tried, in his own way, to care for his sons. But in Harry's narrative, those efforts were invisible, overshadowed by shortcomings. Perhaps the most painful passages were those that addressed Charles not just as a father, but as a man. Harry described his father's insecurities, his frustrations, even his eccentricities. He detailed Charles's habits, his temper, his perceived coldness. These were not just critiques of a parent. They were revelations of a human being, stripped of privacy and dignity. To Charles, who had lived his entire life under the magnifying glass, the betrayal was not just in the words themselves, but in the decision to share them with the world. A son's disapproval had become a son's exposé. The memoir also cast light on Camilla, now queen consort, in ways that further strained the father-son relationship. Harry accused her of playing the long game, of rehabilitating her image at his and William's expense by feeding stories to the press. He painted her as cunning, willing to sacrifice him to protect her reputation. For Charles, who had endured years of public scorn to legitimize his marriage to Camilla, these accusations were intolerable. It wasn't just a son criticizing his stepmother. It was a son undermining the woman Charles had fought to protect and legitimize. To see Camilla maligned in print by Harry must have been a moment of fury and heartbreak combined. The memoir's release was accompanied by interviews where Harry repeated and expanded on its themes. Each media appearance reinforced the image of a son estranged from his father, airing grievances with no sign of remorse. The British press devoured it, while international outlets highlighted the dysfunction of the royal family. For Charles, the humiliation was relentless. His private struggles had become global conversation. His legacy as king was overshadowed by his portrayal as a failed father. The timing made it worse. Charles had only recently ascended the throne following the death of Queen Elizabeth II. This was supposed to be his moment of stability, the culmination of a lifetime of preparation. Instead, as he wore the crown, his son released a book that questioned his humanity. The contrast was stark, the father rising to the highest position of duty, the son pulling him down in the court of public opinion. What hurt Charles most, according to those close to him, was not the damage to the monarchy but the personal sting of rejection. Spare was more than just a memoir. It was a son's verdict on his father. It suggested that every attempt Charles had made to love and support Harry was insufficient. It implied that Harry's pain was rooted not only in the institution but in Charles himself. For a father who had tried, however imperfectly, to provide, this judgment was unbearable. In his silence, Charles carried the weight of words that could not be taken back. He knew history would preserve them, that long after both he and Harry were gone, future generations would read Spare and see him through Harry's lens. The permanence of the memoir was its cruelty. It was not just a temporary headline, but a legacy etched in print. For Charles, that permanence was the ultimate betrayal. And yet, for Harry, the book was catharsis. He saw it as his truth, his chance to finally tell the story as he experienced it. He believed he was breaking free from the silence that had trapped him for decades. In his mind, he was liberating himself from an institution that had stolen his childhood and stifled his adulthood. But for Charles, it was not liberation. It was annihilation of trust. Spare was not merely a book. It was the turning point that convinced Charles that forgiveness was impossible. The Oprah interview had been public humiliation, yes, but interviews fade, headlines are replaced, and scandals are forgotten. Books endure. Harry had chosen to set his criticisms in stone, to publish a narrative that would outlive them both. For Charles, that act crossed a line that no reconciliation could easily erase. In the corridors of the palace, the atmosphere was heavy. Advisors urged caution, silence, and focus on the crown. Publicly, Charles maintained composure, projecting dignity as he carried out his duties. Privately, those who knew him best described a man quietly devastated. He had endured attacks from the press, ridicule from politicians, and even scorn from the public. But this was different. This was his son. This was the boy he had once cradled in his arms, now painting him as unworthy of love in front of the world. Spare did not just break the crown's image. It broke the fragile hope Charles had clung to that one day he and Harry might reconcile. The book's pages closed that chapter forever. From then on, every time Charles looked at his son, he would not just see Harry. He would see the words, the judgments, and the betrayal that had been made permanent. The outside world saw only the silence of King Charles in the face of Harry's attacks. He did not go on television to respond, nor did he issue lengthy statements defending himself. The royal motto, never complain, never explain, remained intact on the surface. But behind the gilded doors of Clarence House and later Buckingham Palace, there was a man deeply wounded, struggling to process the betrayal of his son. Those who have known Charles over the decades describe him as a man of immense sensitivity, someone more prone to melancholy than anger. He is reflective, prone to long nights of reading, writing letters, and talking to plants in his gardens. For such a man, Harry's words and actions were not merely political or institutional slights. They were personal daggers that cut him to the core. Charles has always carried the burden of perception. For most of his adult life, he was painted as the aloof husband who could never live up to Diana's charm, the heir who spent too long waiting for the throne, the man destined to be king but never quite admired by his people. That image haunted him, and though he tried to counter it through charitable work, through his dedication to the environment, and through a life of service, the caricature often overshadowed the reality. For his own son to repeat that narrative in the pages of Spare and in interviews, cold, distant, unloving, was a reinforcement of his greatest fear, that he would go down in history as a man who failed not only his wife, but his children. Those close to him reveal that Charles spent hours reflecting on what went wrong. He would ask himself whether he had missed opportunities to be more present, whether he should have defied tradition to show more affection. He carried the self-doubt of a man who was never naturally suited to the rigid, unemotional standards of royalty. But at the same time, he resented what he saw as Harry's lack of understanding. He had provided financially, ensured education, opened doors of opportunity, and in his own way offered love. Why, he wondered, was none of that remembered? Why was every shortcoming amplified while every effort was dismissed? It was not anger that consumed him, but sorrow. At private dinners, when conversations turned to Harry, Charles would reportedly grow quiet, sometimes staring down at his plate, shaking his head slightly as though words could not capture the depth of his disappointment. Advisors urged him to stay focused on his duties, to let history judge him kindly. But Charles was not just a monarch. He was a father, and fathers feel pain. The anguish was compounded by the fact that this was not private. The whole world was watching, dissecting his failures in headlines and documentaries. The humiliation was global. His anguish was also tied to Camilla. Harry's words about her in Spare, calling her dangerous and accusing her of trading on his and William's vulnerabilities to repair her image, cut Charles to his very core. For decades, Charles had endured ridicule and hatred for his relationship with Camilla. He had fought, sometimes against all odds, to bring her into the family with legitimacy. To now see his son vilify her in such a public way felt like the ultimate rejection, not only of him as a father, but of the woman he loved most. For Charles, it was as if Harry were not just attacking him, but dismantling the life he had spent years trying to build. And yet, in his private anguish, there were moments of quiet fury. Friends recall that Charles, though rarely explosive, could become animated when discussing Harry's choices. He would gesture with his hands, his voice rising slightly as he asked, "Why does he do this? Why to his own family?" But even those outbursts ended in despair. He did not understand Harry's choices, and he could not reconcile them with the boy he had once known. That boy, full of mischief and warmth, seemed gone, replaced by a man hardened by resentment and determined to tell his truth at any cost. The role of king only deepened his inner conflict. As monarch, he was expected to embody dignity, to stand above personal grievances. Every time he stepped into a ceremonial role, every time he was photographed shaking hands with world leaders, he carried the knowledge that behind the grandeur was a family falling apart. He could not speak of it, yet it colored every aspect of his life. When people praised him for his resilience, he smiled politely, but inside he was breaking. Privately, Charles's anguish took the form of long walks in the gardens, conversations with close friends late at night, and letters written but never sent. He has always been a man who seeks solace in the natural world, and in those quiet moments, he would retreat to his gardens to reflect, to process, to mourn. But no garden could erase the reality that his son had chosen to turn his pain into public spectacle. His staff described him as thinner, more tired, his face often lined with the weight of unspoken grief. The crown that had taken 70 years to rest upon his head now felt heavier than ever, not because of state affairs but because of the estrangement of his son. For Charles, the glory of becoming king was overshadowed by the sorrow of fatherhood. This anguish was not static, it evolved. At first, it was shock, then sorrow, and eventually it hardened into resolve. The words, "I will never forgive him," were not uttered in the heat of anger, but in the cold of resignation. They were the words of a man who had come to believe that his son's betrayal was not temporary, not a mistake to be corrected, but a permanent choice. To Charles, Harry had crossed a line that no amount of time or effort could repair. And yet, beneath even that declaration, there lingered the faintest shadow of longing. In his anguish, Charles remained a father. He may have vowed never to forgive, but deep down he mourned not just the betrayal but the absence of the boy he once loved. He longed for Harry, even as he hardened against him. That paradox defined his private torment, the simultaneous love of a father and the resolute distance of a king. This chapter of private anguish reveals why the conflict between Charles and Harry is so devastating. It is not simply about monarchy versus rebellion. It is about the personal cost of duty, the pain of a father who could not meet his son's needs, and the sorrow of a son who could not see his father's efforts. In the quiet of the palace, away from cameras and ceremony, King Charles was not a monarch betrayed by his subject. He was a father betrayed by his son, and in that betrayal lay a sorrow so deep that it reshaped his very soul. In every family conflict, there is often a third figure caught in the middle, and in the case of King Charles and Prince Harry, that figure has always been Prince William. The bond between father and eldest son has historically been different from the bond between father and the younger child. For Charles, William was not only a son but also the heir, the person who would one day succeed him on the throne. This dual role created a closeness built not just on affection but on shared responsibility, a closeness that Harry often viewed with a mix of admiration and bitterness. As the rift between Charles and Harry deepened, William inevitably became both witness and participant in the breakdown, his presence adding fuel to the fire even when he tried to remain neutral. William and Harry had once been inseparable, brothers bound by the tragedy of their mother's death and the shared weight of royal duty. For years, the world saw them as a united front, joking together on royal engagements, comforting one another in grief, and presenting an image of solidarity. But as adulthood unfolded, the paths of the two brothers began to diverge, and those differences fed directly into the tension between Charles and Harry. William, molded from a young age to be king, grew into his role with discipline and acceptance of the crown's demands. Harry, on the other hand, resisted those same demands, feeling suffocated by the role of spare. This divergence shaped Charles's relationships with his sons. With William, he shared the bond of preparation. They spoke about duty, continuity, and the preservation of the monarchy. With Harry, conversations often ended in frustration, as Harry sought freedom from the very traditions Charles and William upheld. This imbalance fed Harry's resentment. He perceived favoritism, the idea that Charles loved William more because William embraced the monarchy while Harry rejected it. And when Meghan entered Harry's life, this perception grew sharper, as William's skepticism of Meghan only widened the gulf. The tension came to a head during the discussions surrounding Harry and Meghan's departure from royal duties. William reportedly aligned closely with Charles in insisting that Harry could not have it both ways, half in, half out. Harry saw this as betrayal, believing his brother should have stood by him. Charles, meanwhile, felt vindicated in William's support. For him, it was proof that at least one son understood the gravity of preserving the monarchy's integrity. But for Harry, it confirmed what he had long feared, that William was the favored son, the loyal heir, while he was expendable. As Harry's criticisms became more public, William's role became even more significant. In interviews and in his memoir, Harry spoke openly of confrontations with his brother, describing shouting matches, arguments, and even physical altercations. These accounts not only shocked the public but also deepened Charles's anguish. To see his sons, once so close, now enemies in all but name, was perhaps even more painful than Harry's attacks on him personally. The very bond Diana had hoped would protect them after her death was fractured beyond recognition. For Charles, who had once taken solace in their closeness, this was another layer of heartbreak. William, for his part, shouldered the responsibility of supporting his father during this period. With Harry estranged, William became Charles's confidant and ally. They shared the burden of media scrutiny, navigated the complexities of Camilla's role as queen consort, and worked together to present a united front to the world. This partnership, while necessary, only reinforced Harry's perception of being excluded. What Harry saw as collusion, Charles and William saw as survival. The public, too, began to draw comparisons. William was increasingly portrayed as the dutiful son, the embodiment of stability and continuity, while Harry was cast as the rebel. These narratives only fueled the divide, creating a dynamic where Charles leaned more heavily on William for support while viewing Harry as a destabilizing force. In private, this dependence may have caused Charles to unconsciously affirm Harry's deepest insecurities, that he was always second best. One of the most symbolic moments came at the coronation. William's role as heir was central, while Harry's presence was peripheral, his seating arrangement and brief appearance sending a clear message. Charles did not need to say anything. The optics spoke volumes. For Harry, it was confirmation of exclusion. For Charles, it was a necessity, a way to ensure the focus remained on the crown and not the family feud. What made William's role so complex was the emotional undertone. Charles loved both his sons, but in very different ways. With William, love was entangled with pride and expectation. With Harry, love was entangled with frustration and disappointment. William's presence amplified these differences, serving as both a reminder of what Charles admired in a son and what he mourned in Harry. This duality contributed to the cold declaration Charles would one day make: "I will never forgive him." It was not only Harry's betrayal, but the stark contrast to William's loyalty that hardened his stance. The divide also forced Charles to confront his own role as a father. He wondered if he had unintentionally created the rift by placing so much emphasis on William as heir. Did he fail to reassure Harry that he was equally loved, even if differently valued? These questions haunted him, but in the face of Harry's relentless public attacks, reflection gave way to self-preservation. He could not change the past, and he could not risk the future of the monarchy by allowing one son's grievances to consume them all. In the end, William's role in the divide cannot be overstated. He became both the pillar that Charles leaned on and the mirror that reflected Harry's pain. His loyalty gave Charles strength, but it also deepened the sense of betrayal when measured against Harry's defiance. The bond between father and eldest son grew stronger as the bond with the youngest disintegrated, leaving Charles with a bittersweet truth. In gaining William's unwavering support, he had lost Harry's love forever. From the very beginning, Meghan Markle's relationship with the monarchy was layered with complexity. To the outside world, her arrival was hailed as a new dawn, a modern, biracial, independent woman stepping into one of the oldest institutions in the world. Her marriage to Harry symbolized change, diversity, and a break from centuries of rigid tradition. But within the walls of the palace, Meghan represented something else entirely: disruption. For King Charles, who had spent his life balancing tradition with the slow, careful adaptation of the monarchy, Meghan's presence was both inspiring and terrifying. She carried with her the promise of renewal, but also the risk of instability. Tension between Meghan and the institution was evident almost from the start. Meghan had been used to autonomy, to speaking her mind, to pursuing her own career and interests. Hollywood had been her world, a place where individuality was celebrated and ambition rewarded. In contrast, the monarchy was a machine of control, where every detail, from a curtsy to a dress color, carried meaning. The clash was inevitable. Charles, who himself had spent decades battling against the suffocating rigidity of palace expectations, could sympathize. But he also knew that survival within the monarchy required compromise, sacrifice, and restraint. Meghan was unwilling to bend in the way Charles once had, and that refusal sparked conflict. One of the earliest points of contention came with Meghan's relationship with the media. The British tabloids were relentless in their coverage, scrutinizing everything from her family background to her mannerisms. Racist undertones in the press further inflamed the situation, painting her as an outsider who didn't belong. Harry saw these attacks as echoes of what had happened to Diana and demanded that the palace defend Meghan with force. But the institution remained largely silent, issuing carefully worded statements at best. For Harry, this silence was betrayal. For Meghan, it was proof that the monarchy would never accept her. For Charles, it was a painful reminder of Diana's struggles and a recognition that history was repeating itself in ways he could not control. Behind palace doors, Meghan's directness clashed with the unspoken codes of the royal household. She questioned traditions, pushed back against hierarchies, and sought changes that staff were unwilling to grant. Reports of disagreements with aides, accusations of bullying, and tension with other family members began to leak into the press. Charles, always cautious, tried to mediate quietly. He wanted Meghan to feel welcomed, and in private moments he extended gestures of kindness. Yet, his efforts were overshadowed by the growing narrative that Meghan was at war with the monarchy itself. Harry's defense of Meghan only deepened the divide. He saw her not just as his wife, but as a symbol of the change he had always longed for. To him, standing by her meant standing against the very institution that had caused so much pain in his life. This placed Charles in an impossible position. As a father, he wanted to support his son and daughter-in-law. As a future king, he had to protect the monarchy from what he viewed as destabilizing challenges. Every time Harry chose Meghan over the family, Charles saw it not only as love, but as rebellion. Meghan, too, became a lightning rod for broader societal debates. For those who admired her, she represented progress, the breaking of barriers in an outdated system. For critics, she was disruptive, unwilling to respect the traditions that had held the monarchy together for centuries. This polarization spilled into Charles's world. His reign, already fragile in its early days, became overshadowed by the ongoing narrative of Meghan versus the crown. Instead of uniting the family, her presence had become the center of division. The personal dynamics worsened as Meghan was blamed, fairly or not, for Harry's estrangement. In Charles's eyes, Meghan amplified Harry's resentment, gave it focus, and encouraged his defiance. Whether this was accurate or merely perception did not matter. To Charles, every interview, every revelation, every criticism carried Meghan's influence. He began to see her less as a daughter-in-law and more as the catalyst for his son's betrayal. The Netflix documentary series that Harry and Meghan produced further solidified this perception. Through candid interviews and carefully chosen footage, they detailed their grievances with the monarchy, painting a picture of neglect, indifference, and cruelty. Once again, Charles was portrayed as distant, unwilling or unable to step in when his son and daughter-in-law needed him most. Camilla was maligned, William was depicted as cold, and the monarchy as a whole was cast as an archaic institution resistant to compassion. For Charles, watching this unfold was like reliving Diana's panorama interview all over again. Another public dismantling of the family, this time led by his own son and Meghan. What made the situation more painful was the contrast between public and private gestures. Charles had walked Meghan down the aisle. He had tried to ensure she felt included during family gatherings. He had spoken publicly about the importance of diversity in Britain. And yet, in the narrative presented by Harry and Meghan, none of this seemed to matter. His efforts were invisible, erased by accusations that he could not forgive or forget. As king, Charles had to make difficult choices. His duty was to the institution, and that meant putting boundaries around Harry and Meghan's independence. Financial support was limited, access to royal privileges was cut off, and a line was drawn between the working royals and the exiled couple in California. These decisions were portrayed by Harry as abandonment, but for Charles, they were necessary acts of preservation. He could not allow personal affection to compromise the monarchy's survival. In doing so, however, he further cemented the image of himself as unloving, a paradox that deepened his anguish. Meghan's role in the saga cannot be overstated. She became both the scapegoat and the symbol, the person Charles believed had drawn Harry away, and the figure Harry believed had shown him what true independence looked like. For Charles, she was the wedge. For Harry, she was salvation. This clash of perspectives was irreconcilable. By the time Charles reportedly declared he would never forgive Harry, the shadow of Meghan loomed large in his reasoning. He did not blame her alone. He knew Harry had made his own choices, but he saw her as the defining influence. In his eyes, Meghan had not only challenged the monarchy, but also taken his son away from him. And for a father who had already lost Diana, the loss of Harry felt like history repeating itself in the most cruel and ironic way. The battle between Meghan and the monarchy was more than a family dispute. It was a collision of two worlds, one rooted in tradition, the other in modernity. And in that collision, Charles found himself powerless, forced to watch as his family fractured beyond repair. Meghan had become the face of a rebellion that Harry championed, and in Charles's mind, it was a rebellion he could never forgive.